19 Common Historical Myths Debunked. The problem with history is, to state the obvious, that it's already happened. If you're unsure about something, there's no way to go back and check, and almost every historical period is full of gaps, uncertainties, and questions that may never be answered. But sometimes, historians do know the real truth, only to find that the general public has decided to go a different way. And from Julius Caesar to President Kennedy, there's a whole range of historical misconceptions that are widely held and wrong. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy gave one of his best-known speeches, pictured, outside the Rathaus Schoneberg in West Berlin, a direct response to the building of the Berlin Wall and the escalating tensions of the Cold War. Addressing the crowd with his usual solemn dignity, Kennedy ingratiated himself by declaring in German, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner. At which point, the story goes, the crowd tittered, because Kennedy's language skills did not match his statecraft. He had not said, "I am a Berliner." He had said, "I am a jelly donut." We wish it were true. We really do. But this fun little anecdote is based on a false premise. A Berliner is indeed a type of donut-esque pastry, but the story rests on the idea that Kennedy's inclusion of the article ein changed the statement's meaning. Pictured here are his phonetic speech notes. The problem is that it just doesn't. That is not how the German language works. The word Berliner, the donut that is, was also not in general use in Berlin at that time. Ah well, it was fun while it lasted. Some political propaganda is so effective that people still believe it 200 years on. It was influential British cartoonist James Gillray who caricatured Napoleon as a short, belligerent, pompous, and ridiculous figure, prone to childish temper tantrums. Little Boney actually measured 5 feet and 7 inches, 1.68 m, slightly above average for his era, but the image stuck. Napoleon himself saw and despised the cartoons, and was quoted in his later years as saying that Gillray did more than all the armies of Europe to bring me down. While we're busting Napoleonic myths, he also did not shoot the nose off the Great Sphinx while in Egypt, and did not spend the night alone in the Great Pyramid. The recent Ridley Scott film, Napoleon, did little to dispel his many mythologies. "He came from nothing, he conquered everything," declared the movie poster, above Joaquin Phoenix's piercing gaze. He came from a family of minor Corsican nobility, and he conquered around 2% of the known world. Today, the white marble constructions of the classical world represent a popular and particular aesthetic. Neoclassical buildings like London's Buckingham Palace, the Prado Museum in Madrid, and the U.S. Capitol gleam white-hot in the summer sun, while the elegant statues of the Renaissance favored form over color in supposed homage to their Greek and Roman forebears. White marble remains a status symbol thanks to its classical connotations, grand yet graceful, opulent yet austere. It's all rather ironic, because the great works of the classical canon were originally brightly colored, perhaps too brightly colored for many modern tastes. Vibrant shades abounded even on stern busts of Roman emperors and the intricate friezes of the Parthenon. Here we see the famous Augustus of Prima Porta statue depicting Rome's first emperor, alongside a replica with rich red robes and patterning. Between the surrender of France in 1940 and Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Britain technically stood alone against the Nazis. But the word alone is so misleading it might as well be false. At that time, the British Empire covered nearly a quarter of the globe, and a mixture of carrot and stick saw men and munitions pour in from Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and beyond. India mobilized 2.5 million soldiers, the largest volunteer army ever assembled, while 1,000 men from the Cayman Islands joined the Royal Navy, equivalent to roughly 2/3 of the adult male population. With Nazi strategists readying invasion plans and the Luftwaffe raining fire on London, the British people must have felt very isolated. Winston Churchill's wartime speeches certainly drew on this spirit of gutsy defiance. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be." And for a few months, the situation looked grim. But the popular image of Britain as a plucky David standing alone against the Nazi Goliath was never accurate, even in its darkest hours. Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan is famous for exactly one thing: being the first person to circumnavigate the globe. His achievement has rung down the centuries, and to date, Magellan has lent his name to a NASA spacecraft, 2 dwarf galaxies, countless cruise liners and container ships, the straits around the southernmost tip of South America, and a species of penguin, the Magellanic penguin. He set sail under the Spanish flag with a fleet of 5 ships in September 1519, and one of those ships, the Victoria, crawled back into port at Seville in 1522, having rounded the world in 2 years and 351 days. There was just one problem. Magellan wasn't on board. The treacherous expedition had been gutted by starvation, desertion, mutiny, hostile encounters with natives, and above all scurvy, the perpetual sailor's disease. Magellan himself was killed in battle in the Philippines. His body was never recovered, and only 18 of his 270-strong crew made it back to Spain under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, the actual first man around the world. Magellan died thinking he'd failed, and would find his modern reputation gratifying, baffling, and amusing. A stalwart of HBO shows and children's birthday parties, the horned Viking helmet is at once both instantly recognizable and utterly mystifying. Once you know that Vikings didn't wear them, and they didn't, the trope emerged in the 19th century. It's hard to understand why they ever would. Only 2 intact Viking helmets have ever been found, pictured, and both are conspicuously smooth-sided. Away from headwear, some Viking stereotypes are gratifyingly accurate. They did indeed travel in wooden longboats with lines of oarsmen assisted by a single sail. They did indeed wield round wooden shields and fearsome battle axes. Swords were the preserve of the upper classes. And they did indeed pillage settlements across Europe with a targeted savagery that inspired fear everywhere from Asia Minor to Ireland. But they did not drink from the skulls of their enemies, because yidu, and nor did they boast a class of frenzied berserker warriors who charged into battle without any clothes. Poor Marie Antoinette. As if being publicly beheaded wasn't bad enough, she's now gone down in history as a byword for greed, callousness, and excess, thanks mostly to a line of dialogue that is, at best, a mistranslation. The notorious phrase reads, qu'il mange de la brioche, and while brioche bread was considered a luxury in 18th century France, it's hardly the Victoria sponge so often imagined by modern minds. More importantly, she never said it. The phrase is drawn from Confessions, a work by philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which was written 24 years before the French Revolution when Antoinette was 11 years old. Antoinette was viscerally hated in her era, but modern historians take a kindlier tone. She was a convenient lightning rod for French frustration, foreign, female, royal, even though her unhappy marriage left her with minimal power. But, references to baked goods aside, her reputation for extravagance was well earned. Medieval societies did think some pretty eyebrow-raising things. Widespread beliefs included that evil spirits lived inside Brussels sprouts, that cats were vessels for Satan, and that rubbing yourself with a live chicken could cure plague. But flat earth theory, still occasionally believed today, was old hat even before the beginning of the Dark Ages. Ancient Greek mathematician Pythagoras was the first to argue that the world was round in around 500 BC, with fellow countryman Aristotle confirming his findings 150 years later. Fast forward another century, and Greek astronomer Eratosthenes had measured Earth's circumference and got it right within a few miles. We don't know what Fred the feudal farmer thought about the shape of the Earth, but, in the words of historian Geoffrey Burton Russell, no educated person in the history of Western civilization from the 3rd century BC onwards believed that the Earth was flat. Pictured here is a replica of the Erdapfel, the oldest surviving globe constructed by Martin Behaim in 1492. Fittingly, that's the same year Columbus sailed for America, and perhaps the most prevailing part of this myth is that he'd set out to prove the Earth was round. It's true that Columbus was trying to reach East Asia, but he was solely seeking a new trade route. Even by the standards of medieval warfare, sieges were brutal affairs. Attackers would bombard ramparts with complex siege engines like trebuchets and ballistae, tunnel beneath fortifications to undermine their foundations, and set up perimeters to starve out garrisons over months or even years. Defenders would fire crossbow bolts through arrow slits, dig ditches to hamper ladders and siege towers, and construct tunnels of their own to maintain their crucial water supply. Oil was valuable, difficult to use, and usually in short supply, so it would have been an expensive and cumbersome addition to a fortress's arsenal. As a general rule, ancient and medieval warfare was a lot less elaborate than pop culture would have you believe, particularly during sieges when resources were scarce. Why bother raiding your depleted kitchens for cooking oil when you could simply scald your enemy with boiling water, or, better still, clunk them on the head with a rock? Called a teardrop on the cheek of time by Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, the Taj Mahal is world-renowned for the transcendent beauty not only of its architecture, but its backstory. Built by heartbroken Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan as a mausoleum for his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, the Taj is a symbol of enduring love and beauty that was always intended to ring down the centuries. So determined was he that no future monument should ever rival its beauty that Shah Jahan cut off the hands of each of the 20,000 laborers that worked on the site. It's easy to see why this mix of high romance and unspeakable cruelty appeals to storytellers, but it is just that, a story. Unfortunately, mass mutilations do appear elsewhere in the historical record. In the 13th century, some Mongol conquerors kept track of their victims by severing their right ears and then counting them up in large piles. Byzantine Emperor Basil the Bulgar Slayer, pictured, meanwhile, is thought to have blinded up to 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners in AD 1014, leaving just one man in every 100 with his sight so he could lead the others home. Two heavily armed fighters locked in a single battle before a crowd baying for blood. It can be hard to see how gladiatorial combat wouldn't end in death. But the life of a gladiator was not always nasty, brutish, and short. A successful gladiator could become a celebrity, with portraits in public places and even product endorsements. Some modern estimates suggest that only 1 in 10 gladiatorial contests ended with death, and enough victories in the arena could earn an enslaved gladiator his freedom, symbolized by the bestowing of a wooden sword. It was Roman author Juvenal who famously wrote that bread and circuses were the only things necessary to keep the common people from revolt, and it's hard to maintain a steady supply of circuses if you keep killing all the clowns. History is written by the winners, and perhaps nowhere is this truer than 16th century Mexico. The Spanish conquest of the Aztecs is prime myth-making territory, as most of our sources are self-aggrandizing retrospectives by victorious conquistadors describing events that happened deep in the jungle. A profound sense of cultural and religious superiority oozes from these accounts, obscuring the customs and perspectives of the defeated Aztecs, many of whom did not live to tell their tales. Chief among these myths is the idea that the Aztecs thought the Spanish were deities, specifically the prophesied return of the creator god Quetzalcoatl, pictured. This notion was cooked up by Franciscan friars in the late 1500s and is absent even from most Spanish sources. Even Cortés himself, the leader of the conquistadors and one of history's least modest individuals, makes no mention of it. It's comforting to think that misunderstood genius might lie dormant within us all, and the claim that Einstein failed maths as a child has provided solace to generations of underachieving school kids. There's a grain of truth here. In 1895, Einstein took and failed an entrance exam to study electrical engineering in Zurich, age 16. But,